Jesus is King. Welcome to another edition of Mass Confusion here on the Mass of the Ages YouTube channel. I'm Timothy Flanders from 1 Peter 5. Today's topic, the Latin Mass without a hand missal. That's right, we're talking to all you mothers out there juggling 6 children at once. In fact, you don't have to have a hand missal to participate fruitfully in the holy sacrifice of the Mass. And this is because the Latin Mass assumes no hand missal. As you probably know, hand missals were not really invented until the 19th century. So for 1800 years, the faithful participated in the Latin Mass without a hand missal. Not only that, they could not read. Why is this? We're going to look at this and how this relates to liturgical controversies in this episode. First, a concession. I'm not saying the hand missal is a bad thing at all. Hand missal is very effective, very profitable for many souls. If it works for you, go for it. Absolutely. And we're going to talk about some of the aspects of this and come to a conclusion. But here's the fundamental assertion today, is that the ancient Roman Rite, the Latin Mass, flourished in a liturgical oral culture where the faithful, clergy and laity, drew spiritual fruit from multiple forms of active participation. So what I'm going to say here today is that the Latin Mass forms and is formed by oral culture, and that's true of every ancient apostolic rite of the church. They were born in an oral culture and flourished in an oral culture with an overlapping form of oral liturgical participation. Now, the new Mass, and even the Latin Mass in the early 20th century, tends to favor one form of participation above all others, the literary participation. And this is to the detriment of other forms, which, in my view, ends up hindering participation. So, post your questions now. Cameron says, what's your favorite hand missal? I'll get to my favorite hand missal later in the broadcast. So we've talked about this model. This is from my book, City of God, City of Man, talking about how the liturgy fits into a culture. So this is that whole framework that we talked about. But these peoples, this framework of a people, this is a framework based on oral culture. And this is what all cultures were before 1500. The invention of the printing press, late 15th century, begins to spread literary culture throughout the world. Now, what is an oral culture? Well, it's one that communicates primarily by oral, not written means. So the use of language, but also, and more impactfully perhaps, sounds, signs, and signals. So the Latin Mass assumes you can't read. And so the whole structure of the Latin Mass is built for an oral culture. So you don't need to be reading anything to participate very fruitfully in the Latin Mass. So let's look at some of the aspects of oral culture. Number one, every person begins to learn and understand by oral culture. So a child learns to speak and hear and listen and understand both verbal and nonverbal communications before the child can read or write. And this is oral culture. So each one of us is born into an oral culture already when they're first born because they don't read or write. And so the very foundation of our natural communication is this oral culture. It's the most natural for any person in any era, even when it diminishes in various times and places. So that's the first aspect to this, and this is something that we've emphasized before, the way that Latin Mass is made for children. It's something where children understand something about the Latin Mass that adults miss. And one of this is the fact that there's this sort of oral culture foundation to every single human person based on their own development. So, number 2, oral cultures remember things better. So this is, maybe you've heard of the phenomenon where if someone is blind, they hear better than other people who can see. Well, the same is true for oral cultures. People who cannot read remember things better. They can hear things once and then remember them forever. This is something that you can still, anthropologists can still observe this in various cultures which are still oral cultures that don't read or write. They don't have written communication. Where people will, like, for example, Homer's Odyssey is this epic poem. It takes 24 hours to recite it. I know that because we did that in college. We recited the entire Odyssey in shifts, and it took 24 hours. Homer's Odyssey is an epic poem, though. This is the type of thing that people would memorize. They would memorize these epic poems that take hours to recite something. But this is what oral culture is. This is sort of the natural outgrowth of that early childhood development in oral culture. So what happens is oral cultures know multiple languages, which makes sacred languages not as difficult as they may seem to us now today, especially if we're Anglos and our first language is English. We don't know any other languages. So the historic norm in the Catholic Church, whether that's the Latin Rite or various other rites of the Church, is an overlapping bilingual liturgical and paraliturgical celebration. So the local vernacular combines with a universal sacred language. Well, what do I mean by that? Let me give you an example. So we have the Feast of Corpus Christi, for example, is a paraliturgical, it's a liturgy. There's also a paraliturgical portion to that, where there's a whole procession that's tied to that. But there are liturgical actions, signs, and symbols within the liturgy which all of the faithful participate in. At the elevation, they see the host. And the ocular participation, seeing the host, is united with the paraliturgical celebration of the procession, seeing the host. And all of these things are just overlapping. So there's also these vernacular devotions that are being done by the people, which overlap the liturgy. So they're doing the devotions outside the liturgy, and they're doing the devotions inside the liturgy. And there's a fluid overlapping of their own vernacular language, which is then combined with the clergy who are using their sacred tongue. And this is what keeps a very hyper-localized customs in place, which help ground the faith of little children who grow up and with these customs and everything, with a connection with that universality, that antiquity that we all talked about in the sacred language episode. So this is kind of the historic norm, is to have this sort of bilingual, paraliturgical and liturgical overlapping oral culture in the liturgy. And now we see this. What's interesting is that I forgot to mention, oh, by the way, post your questions now. I forgot to mention there was 2 books that I wanted to recommend. One is The Liturgy, The Family and Crisis of Modernity by Joseph Shaw. And he has a chapter on understanding liturgical participation. I'm drawing on that here, talking about the participation of the faithful in this from this oral culture tradition. And then also my own book on the Holy Bible, Introduction to the Holy Bible. We talk a lot about oral culture and how that impacts the Holy Scripture as a liturgical material. The material for liturgy is the Holy Scripture. So, what this means is what's interesting that Shaw brings out is that he talks about how when the Protestants started translating their liturgies into the vernacular, they necessarily had to exclude people from the liturgy. Why is that? It's because there were all these local dialects in all these local regions. So Thomas Cranmer imposes the English Mass, but to do so, he actually had to choose one of the English dialects and impose that on all these people. So there was a loss of a universality where the clergy could participate in their sacred tongue, And then there was a loss of that locality, that subsidiarity, the local customs, and instead was imposed just a particular language at a particular time from a particular class of people that is dated to that time. So there's all these issues that end up arising here with this situation when we lose that bilingual reality of the oral fluid culture that's traditional. So let's continue. Oral culture is more impacted by sounds and symbols. So we talked about this note from the Summa where we're talking about just natural law, the natural inclination of the various nations as they develop their own liturgical rites, even outside the Christian religion. But just talking about natural law, we can see how this oral culture impacts, and there's that the immensity of the signs and symbols that we've talked about before. We talked about symbols before, and the oral culture is just kind of what wraps this all together. The oral culture provides that the memorization and the vernacular, the local vernacular, the sacred tongue is put together in that with the symbols. So we have this whole oral, traditional, liturgical culture, and that is what is traditional. So the point is that oral culture is not inferior to literary culture necessarily. As I said, the laity participated for 1,800 years in the liturgy by means of oral culture without hand missals. So as I talked about that overlapping liturgy, what did the faithful do? They did mental prayer. An important note is that mental prayer, considered in and of itself, mental prayer is superior to vocal prayer in the spiritual life. So when you are doing mental prayer, you're operating at a higher spiritual level. People pray the rosary during the Holy Mass. This is something that I particularly favor. That's what I do at Mass. I pray the rosary. I wrote this article at 1 Peter 5 a while back, how to pray the rosary at Mass. And what I found was that there was all these connections between the reality of the rosary mysteries. So the introit is the Annunciation, the Kyrie is the Visitation, the Gloria is the birth of Christ. And then at the canon, you do the sorrowful mysteries, the scourging, the crown of thorns, the consecration, etc., etc. Now, these are just methods that work for me. I'm not saying that everyone has to use this particular method. I'm simply saying that the faithful for centuries use various other methods than a hand missal, than reading what the prayers were in the Mass, what the clergy were praying, to participate fruitfully. There's also the prayers at Mass. So these were various prayers that were written by saints that were written down. There's, if you have the Blessed Be God prayer book, for example, that has a method of having prayers at Mass. So what this is it would just basically say, at the introit, pray this prayer. And it was just kind of like, I offer this entrance to you, et cetera, and then the Kyrie, you would pray some prayers then. So it has these various private prayers written down for various portions in the Mass. And I should say also Pius X's Catechism, in fact, confirms the profitability of praying the rosary at Mass. I didn't mention that. Then you have spiritual reading, just meditation and with silence on the signs and symbols. So there's a certain freedom of the laity in this traditional oral culture where you can enter into the fruitful participation of the Mass without a hand missal. So now, what happened after 1800? This was when there was the first Industrial Revolution, and there was a massive migration out of these traditional locations of oral Christendom culture into the cities, which were not conducive to the existing paraliturgical culture. So the net result was that there was a loss of this oral culture that had undergirded the liturgy for so long. And so this was something that deeply affected the laity, so that many parents had difficulty passing down the faith. You moved into the urban environment, the working long hours, They don't have the same countryside that had those places and the shrine and that and this thing that would all integrate with the liturgies. That the liturgy, as I said, the cultus forms the whole culture. And so these different places that people were uprooted from had been formed by this liturgical culture. And when you lose that, it's very difficult. So the church was trying to play catch up. In fact, Owen Chadwick, in his book Secularization of the European Mind in the 19th Century, he says that there was so much migration that the church did not have time to build enough parishes to house all the people. And that was one of the reasons why people were not going to church. They didn't even have enough churches. So much less enough of this oral culture. So we have this situation that arose at this time. And this is where the hand missal developed. This was an attempt to help the faithful quickly to begin to participate again in the Holy Mass. But what ended up happening, so first of all, it's a very good solution, and it has lots of big benefits. The most conspicuous of which is that the faithful can read the prayers of the Mass in their own vernacular to enter into what is being said with understanding. That's certainly something to be highly prized by the church, and it always has been, even if a sacred language is maintained. But what happened was the prior oral participation was replaced with literary participation, which was formerly mainly the domain of the clergy. So gradually the assumption was made that if the laity did not participate in the way that the clergy did, then they were not participating. So there was a loss of valuing the way that the faithful and the laity had participated in their own way. An example of this is the 1955 Holy Week reform. So Holy Week obviously was the most cherished week of the entire year liturgically, but there was somewhat of a divide in many areas between the liturgical and paraliturgical services of Holy Week. So the 1955 week, so the way it was before 1955 was that the Triduum services happened in the morning, and then there were various other paraliturgical services that were very enthusiastically participated in by the laity. For example, the devotion to the 7 last words of Christ on Good Friday. The Stations of the Cross, obviously. There's the visits to the 7 churches, the 7 altars during Holy Week. And there's a lot of liturgical participations. There's also Tenebrae. Tenebrae, because the Triduum services happened in the morning, Tenebrae service, which is the Matin service, that happened in the evening, and that was very highly attended by the laity as well. And notably, Tenebrae service, the power of it, it's a significantly long service, all in Latin, but there's a great deal of pageantry. They're lighting these candles. It's getting darker. There's the great clashing of the sound at the end of the service. I love Tenebrae. It's one of my favorite services. But what happened here was that because there was this sort of assumption that the laity have to participate in this one thing that the clergy do, or else they're not really participating, they moved the services to the evening, which was denigrating Tenebrae. That was one of the liturgical services that the laity liked the most. And so there was sort of this assumption that the clergy had to give the laity a way to participate in the clergy's prayers. And this is what sort of did violence to many of the cherished customs of Holy Week beginning in 1955. And the new Mass assumes that same sort of assumption, is that the laity need to participate more and more in what the clerics used to do, or else they're not really participating. And all of this is sort of this trend which favors this form of participation against another. So here's where we come to this very important text from Sacrosanctum Concilium. So here's the quote. In the restoration and promotion of the sacred liturgy, this full and active participation by all the people is the aim to be considered before all else. For it is the primary and indispensable source from which the faithful are to derive the true Christian spirit, and therefore pastors of souls must zealously strive to achieve it by means of the necessary instruction in all their pastoral work. End quote. So there's two ways to understand this quote. On the one hand, there is Pope Benedict, he's famous for the hermeneutic of continuity and rupture. There's a way to read this with a rupture. The way you read it with a rupture is the way that Bonini took it, and he said, well, because all these faithful did not actively to participate in terms of they were reading and praying the words with intellectual understanding for all these centuries, therefore they were deprived of the true Christian spirit. And this is something that Archbishop Lefebvre in his book, Letter to Confused Catholics, he says this is incomprehensible. You're saying that all of our forefathers, because they didn't have this vernacular intellectual comprehension, they were deprived of the true Christian spirit. That's just incomprehensible to think such a thing. Think of all our forefathers who left their families and their lands to go on a crusade and die for their brethren. And you think they were deprived of the true Christian spirit because they didn't know Latin? Well, that's the rupture way of seeing this. The continuity way of seeing this text is that if we look at it through the lens of the tradition, and we say that full and active participation does not necessarily mean that you are reading the same prayers as the priest, that you are following along in a hand missal. It does not necessarily mean that. It does mean that you are uniting with the mysteries of Christ celebrated at the altar. You're uniting your sacrifice to the sacrifice of the priest. But this needs to be able to be taken in many forms. And the reason is actually, if we go back before Sacrosanctum Concilium and we go to Pius XII, and we read this quote from Mediator Dei, paragraph 108. Quote, "Many of the faithful are unable to use the Roman Missal, even though it is written in the vernacular, nor are all capable of understanding correctly the liturgical rites and formulas. So varied and diverse are men's talents and characters that it is impossible for all to be moved and attracted to the same extent by community prayers, hymns, and liturgical services. Moreover, the needs and inclinations are not the same, nor are they always constant in the same individual. Who then would say, on account of such a prejudice, that all these Christians cannot participate in the Mass nor share its fruits? On the contrary, they can adopt some other method which proves easier for certain people. For instance, they can lovingly meditate on the mysteries of Jesus Christ, or perform other exercises of piety, or recite prayers which, though they differ from the sacred rites, are still essentially in harmony with them." End quote. So he's saying, this is what I said in my article on the Rosary, you are meditating on the Rosary is meditating on what the Mass is. The Mass is the Passion of Jesus Christ, sacramentally present. So if you are meditating on the Passion of Jesus Christ during the Mass, you are uniting yourself directly with the Mass. The Mass is the Passion, and the Rosary is a meditation on that Passion. Here is Joseph Ratzinger on active participation. Spirit of the Liturgy, page 171. He says this. He says, "What does active participation mean in the Sacrosanctum Concilium?" He says, "Unfortunately, the word was very quickly misunderstood to mean something external, entailing a need for general activity, as if as many people as possible, as often as possible, should be visibly engaged in action. However, the word participation refers to a principal action in which everyone has a part." He goes on the 2 pages later. He says, "The real action in the liturgy in which we are all supposed to participate is the action of God himself. The whole event of the incarnation, cross, resurrection, and second coming is present as the way by which God draws man into cooperation with himself. But we must still pray for it to become our sacrifice, that we ourselves, as we said, may be transformed into the Logos, conform to the Logos, and so be made the true body of Christ." So what Ratzinger is saying here is that the main active action is God himself in the liturgy, and man is participating in it. What does the term liturgy mean, by the way? A liturgy is a Greek word which refers to an ancient municipal thing where a rich man would provide the money so that somebody could build a bridge or do some public act. That's a liturgy. So God is the rich man providing the means for us to participate in this thing, without which we could not do anything. It does not mean the work of the people. This was a misconception given by many liturgists. Liturgy does not mean the work of the people. It means the work of God that we can participate in. And Ratzinger says we have to add our sacrifice to it, to add our participation therein in God's own action. But this can take very many forms. And this is what we're trying to emphasize here with oral culture. The long and the short of it is this. The prayers of the church, i.e. the prayers of the Missal, are objectively superior to other prayers at Mass, since they are the public prayer of Christ in the liturgy. However, other prayers may be subjectively superior for any given individual, since they more easily participate in the liturgy thereby. So if we consider them in themselves, the prayers of the Mass are always objectively superior to whatever I come up with. That's certainly true. We're talking about the Psalms versus my personal prayer. The Psalms will always win, considered in themselves. But the other aspect of it is that Christ is working in the liturgy so that I may participate in the liturgy. And the faithful should be allowed to have options of other forms of participation if they find them more fruitful. So that is the dichotomy, I think, that helps to resolve that, because we do want to favor the prayers of the church. We want to favor them because they are the public prayer of the church. They're the public prayer of Christ. We do favor them, and we should, and we always have, but not to the denigration of the pious customs of the faithful. So that is the presentation today. Remember to go to latinmass.com/give. Mass of the Ages is an organization where we are trying to become the front porch of the trad movement, where people can Google Latin Mass and they come up with latinmass.com and they get the front porch. They're welcomed in. They're welcome into traditional Catholicism, and it's something that helps all Latin Mass communities, no matter where they come from. So go to latinmass.com/give to become a monthly donor today, and be sure to join the Eucharistic Crusade of Reparation, 1peter5.com/crusade. The spiritual requirements are 1 hour of Eucharistic reparation per month and praying the prayer of His Excellency, Bishop Athanasius Schneider. At least. That's the beginning. You can get a Crusader cross, be invested in the sacramental, but that's the beginning. The crusade is upon us, and this is the crusade of our time. So, let's take a look at questions. If you have a question, post it now. I'm just going to scroll up. Let me see. I'm just taking a look at all of the comments here. John says, Bonini did leave a mark in church history before he died in 1982. Certainly true. Henry says, why is such a council allowed to stand when it was a non-spirit led mess by a communist subverter? Well, in the history of the church, there's been many ecumenical councils that have been quite a mess. We just celebrated the Council of Ephesus on October 11, which was also a mess, which caused a schism immediately after the council. So there's very few trads who do not admit that Vatican II is an ecumenical council. So I'm not sure if you want to clarify exactly what you're getting at there. I'm taking a look at other questions. Anybody else? Send them to the chat. Yes, Cavazos is mentioning, I believe what you're getting at here, Cavazos, is the quote by St. Gregory the Theologian, a.k.a. St. Gregory Nazianzus. He was the Patriarch of Constantinople during the Second Ecumenical Council, and he was so perturbed by it that he resigned as the Patriarch. And he has this quote that says something to the effect of, I don't like synods because synods always cause more evil than good. Something quite severe that he gave to that. Yes, so it is certainly a huge thing. Traditional Thomas mentions passion plays. Yeah, that's a great additional paraliturgical thing. Somebody else had stained glass windows in the chat. That's a excellent addition too. Cameron says, I'm not trad enough for Tenebrae yet. One day though. Traditional Thomas says, I've served traditional Tenebrae. The hallowing of hell after the last candle is extinguished is epic. Absolutely. Brian says, the Irish that moved to the big cities in Scotland only had Highland priests at first. Yeah, so this is mentioning the urbanization and what was lost and the difficulties of that. I see Cameron says, what's your favorite missal? I do use the Lassance Missal, the so-called New Roman Missal. And Cameron brings up a good point. Do we need hand missals since we are no longer living in an oral culture? I do think that it's pastorally evident that it's very fruitful for many souls because there is this lack of oral culture. And so it does seem that there should be more hand missals. But if we make that assumption that we have to be participating in that way, I think that does lead to the assumptions of the new Mass, ultimately. So that is all we have today. So thanks so much for watching. Again, this has been Mass Confusion. I'm Timothy Flanders from 1 Peter 5. God bless everybody.
The Mass of the Ages donors are bringing traditional Catholicism to millions. Go to latinmass.com/give to join the movement.